The deep, silent waters of the world's oceans are home to a quiet, rusting necropolis. For decades, maritime explorers have crossed vast distances to locate and document the skeletal remains of World War II's most legendary steel titans. In 1989, oceanographer Robert Ballard plunged nearly 15,000 feet into the crushing darkness of the Atlantic to find the Bismarck, resting upright on an extinct underwater volcano, forever preserved in the silent deep. But when historians, divers, and deep-sea explorers look for the Bismarck's direct sister ship, the colossal Tirpitz, the heaviest battleship ever built by a European nation, they are met with a baffling, hollow void. Where there should be a towering, majestic underwater monument to one of the most feared warships in human history, there is almost nothing. This is not because her final resting place is an unsolved mystery. We know exactly where the Tirpitz was destroyed, down to the precise GPS coordinates in the frigid northern waters of Norway. We have the photographs of her capsized hull, the detailed logs of the British bombers who sent her to the bottom, and the testimonies of the traumatized survivors who crawled out from her upturned belly. Yet, if you traveled to the quiet fjord of Hakøybotn near Tromsø today, you would find no colossal superstructure rising from the seabed, no pristine teak decks preserved by the cold, and no twin-barrel 15-inch gun turrets guarding an underwater tomb. The sister of the world's most famous shipwreck is effectively missing, gone from the ocean floor. The story of her disappearance is not a tale of lost coordinates, but a dramatic saga of post-war desperation, industrial-scale cannibalism, and a bizarre scientific phenomenon that turned her radioactive-free steel into one of the most sought-after materials on Earth. To understand why the Tirpitz vanished from her watery grave, we must first go back to the tense, smoke-filled naval design offices of the Kriegsmarine in 1935. Under the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, Germany was nominally permitted to build capital ships, but was theoretically bound by the strict limits of the Washington Naval Treaty, which capped battleship displacement at 35,000 long tons. But the German design team had no intention of staying within those boundaries. They envisioned a pair of super battleships that could comfortably overpower any vessel the French or British could put to sea. The result was the Bismarck class. While the lead ship, the Bismarck, would capture the world's attention with her dramatic, short-lived Atlantic breakout and subsequent destruction in May 1941, her younger sister, the Tirpitz, was designed to be even more formidable. Laid down at the Kriegsmarinewerft in Wilhelmshaven in November 1936, the Tirpitz was launched on April 1, 1939, in an elaborate ceremony attended by Adolf Hitler. The ship was christened by Ilse von Hassel, the daughter of Grand Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, the architect of the old Imperial German Navy. When the Tirpitz was fully fitted out and commissioned in February 1941, she was a masterpiece of lethal engineering. She displaced 42,900 metric tons standard, ballooning to an astronomical 52,600 metric tons when fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and provisions. She stretched over 823 feet in length and possessed a beam of 118 feet. Her heart was a massive labyrinth of 12 oil-fired Wagner superheated water tube boilers, powering 3 Brown, Boveri, and CA-geared steam turbines that generated a staggering 160,795 shaft horsepower. This immense power plant allowed the giant steel mountain to cut through the water at speeds exceeding 30 knots. But it was her armor and weaponry that truly terrified her adversaries. Her main battery consisted of 8 38-centimeter SAC C/34 guns, arranged in 4 twin turrets, Anton and Bruno forward, Caesar and Dora aft. These massive barrels could hurl an 1,800-pound high-explosive or armor-piercing shell over 22 miles with pinpoint accuracy. Surrounding her vitals was a heavy belt of Krupp-cemented steel armor up to 12.5 inches thick, coupled with a highly complex turtleback armored deck design designed to deflect flat trajectory shells at close to medium ranges. Yet, for all her terrifying potential, the Tirpitz's strategic role was destined to be very different from that of her sister. After the tragic loss of the Bismarck, a shaken Adolf Hitler grew deeply paranoid about losing his remaining heavy surface units. He forbade the Tirpitz from embarking on high-risk Atlantic raiding sorties, choosing instead to send her north. In January 1942, the Tirpitz slipped into the icy, narrow fjords of occupied Norway. Here, she earned her legendary moniker, the Queen of the North. She became a classic example of what naval theorists call a fleet in being. By her mere presence in the Norwegian fjords, she did not even have to fire her guns to disrupt the Allied war effort. Her existence forced the British Royal Navy to permanently station a powerful fleet of battleships and aircraft carriers in northern waters to guard against a potential breakout. More critically, she cast a dark, suffocating shadow over the Arctic convoys, the vital Allied supply lines carrying tanks, planes, and ammunition through the freezing Barents Sea to the hard-pressed Soviet forces in Murmansk. The terror she inspired was demonstrated in July 1942 during the infamous saga of Convoy PQ-17. When intelligence reached the British Admiralty that the Tirpitz was preparing to sortie to intercept the convoy, a wave of panic swept through the naval command. Fearing the total slaughter of the vulnerable merchantmen, the First Sea Lord ordered the escorting warships to withdraw and the convoy to scatter. Left entirely defenseless, the scattered merchant ships were hunted down one by German U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers. 21 out of 34 merchant vessels were sent to the bottom of the icy sea, along with over 400 tanks, 200 aircraft, and 3,000 military vehicles. Ironically, the Tirpitz had barely left her anchorage before the German High Command, fearful of Allied air attacks, ordered her to turn back. The mere rumor of her departure had destroyed the convoy. To Winston Churchill, the Tirpitz was a personal obsession. He referred to her simply as the Beast, and declared that the destruction of this single ship was the most important naval task of the war. For 3 long years, the British launched a relentless, highly creative, and incredibly costly campaign to destroy her. The defenses protecting the Tirpitz in her Norwegian anchorages, such as the remote Fetten Fjord and Kolfjord, were nearly impregnable. She was tucked deep inside narrow inlets, shielded by towering vertical cliffs that made conventional high-altitude bombing almost impossible. She was surrounded by multiple layers of heavy steel anti-torpedo and anti-submarine nets. Along the shore, the Germans installed massive networks of artificial fog generators. Within minutes of an air raid alarm, these generators would flood the entire fjord with a thick, chemical sulfur smoke, completely swallowing the 800-foot battleship in an impenetrable white cloud. Faced with these obstacles, the British resorted to extraordinary measures. In September 1943, they launched Operation Source, employing top-secret, highly dangerous X-craft midget submarines. These tiny 4-man vessels were towed across the rough North Sea by full-size submarines before slipping silently past the German hydrophones and through the narrow gaps in the Tirpitz's torpedo nets. 2 of these craft, X-6 commanded by Lieutenant Donald Cameron and X-7 commanded by Lieutenant Godfrey Place, succeeded in dropping 4 massive 2-ton ground mines directly beneath the battleship's keel before they were detected and forced to scuttle. The resulting detonations were colossal. The blast violently lifted the 50,000-ton warship out of the water, tearing open her double bottom, rupturing her fuel tanks, disabling her turbo generators, and throwing one of her massive 15-inch gun turrets completely off its roller bearings. It was a devastating blow that left the Tirpitz crippled and listing, requiring months of heroic improvisational engineering by German repair crews to make her semi-operational again. Both Cameron and Place were captured, and later awarded the Victoria Cross for their unimaginable bravery. Yet, the Beast lived on. In April 1944, just as the Tirpitz was finishing her repairs, the Royal Navy struck again with Operation Tungsten. Flying off a massive fleet of 6 aircraft carriers, dozens of Barracuda dive bombers caught the Germans by surprise before the fog generators could fully obscure the ship. They scored 15 direct hits with medium-sized bombs, killing over 120 German crewmen and wounding 300 more. But the Tirpitz's heavy armored deck held. The bombs wrecked her superstructure and caused extensive fires, but failed to pierce her vitals. Realizing that conventional carrier-borne bombs were simply not heavy enough to destroy this steel fortress, the British turned the task over to the Royal Air Force's legendary No. 617 Dambusters and No. 9 Squadrons, commanded by Wing Commander James Bryan Willie Tate. These elite crews flew the rugged 4-engined Avro Lancaster bomber, modified to carry the ultimate weapon of destruction, the Tallboy bomb. Designed by the brilliant British engineer Barnes Wallis, the Tallboy was not a conventional bomb. It was a 12,000-pound aerodynamic masterpiece of hardened steel. When dropped from 20,000 feet, the bomb would exceed the speed of sound. Its offset fins caused it to spin rapidly, stabilizing its flight like a rifle bullet. It was designed to plunge deep into the earth or pass straight through a battleship's armor before detonating, creating a localized earthquake that would shatter a ship's hull from the inside out. By late October 1944, the battered Tirpitz was no longer fully seaworthy. Her damaged engines could no longer safely drive her through the open ocean. The German Naval Command decided to move her south to the island of Hokoya, just off the city of Tromsø. Here, she was permanently moored in shallow water to serve as a floating, semi-static coastal defense artillery battery. The Grand Admiral of the Kriegsmarine, Karl Dönitz, believed that by keeping her in shallow waters, even if she were heavily damaged, she could not sink and would remain a potent defensive weapon. It was a fatal miscalculation. The final act of the Tirpitz's long, agonizing destruction occurred on the morning of November 12, 1944. The weather over Tromsø was unusually, tragically clear. 32 Lancaster bombers approached from the east, having flown from their temporary bases in Scotland, bypass route via Swedish airspace to avoid early radar detection. On board the Tirpitz, the crew was plunged into a state of panic. The ship's commander, Captain Wolf Jung, desperately radioed the nearby German Luftwaffe base at Bardufoss, pleading for fighter cover. But a series of catastrophic communication failures, coupled with the fact that the Luftwaffe had not been properly notified of the battleship's exact new position at Hokoya, meant that the German Focke-Wulf 190 fighters remained grounded on their airfields, entirely unaware of the impending slaughter. The Tirpitz was left completely alone. At 9:41 a.m., the sky erupted. The Tirpitz's massive main battery guns opened fire, hurling 38-centimeter shrapnel shells into the path of the oncoming bombers. But the Lancasters pressed on relentlessly through the heavy flak. From an altitude of 14,000 feet, the bomb aimers released their massive tallboys. The heavy missiles screamed down through the cold morning air. The first bomb struck the Tirpitz directly between her two forward main turrets, Anton and Bruno, but miraculously failed to detonate. Seconds later, a second tallboy scored a catastrophic direct hit amidships, tearing through the superstructure, slicing through the heavy armored deck, and exploding deep inside the boiler room. The force of the explosion ripped a massive hole in the ship's port side, instantly destroying her internal bulkhead walls and causing thousands of tons of freezing seawater to rush into the hull. A third tallboy struck near the stern, damaging her steering gear and propeller shafts. The Tirpitz began to list violently to port, reaching an angle of 30 degrees within minutes. Captain Junge issued the order to abandon ship, but for hundreds of men trapped in the lower decks, it was already too late. The power failed, plunging the tilting corridors into pitch-black chaos. At 9:50 a.m., the list reached 60 degrees. Suddenly, a massive, earth-shaking explosion ripped through the ship's aft section. The intense heat of the spreading fires had reached the ammunition magazine of turret Caesar. The resulting detonation was so violent that it lifted the entire 1,000-ton main battery turret off its mountings and threw it high into the air. The turret crashed back into the freezing water, obliterating a group of swimming survivors. Under the force of this final explosion, the Queen of the North completely capsized, turning entirely upside down in the shallow water. Her massive, rounded keel and propeller shafts now pointed uselessly toward the gray Norwegian sky, while her superstructure and masts were crushed into the muddy seabed. Out of the 1,700 men on board that morning, between 950 and 1,200 lost their lives. Many drowned in the freezing waters of the fjord, but hundreds of others were trapped alive inside the dark, upturned hull. In the hours after the attack, German rescue teams scrambled onto the exposed bottom of the ship. Armed with blowtorches, they listened to the desperate, rhythmic tapping of their comrades echoing through the thick steel plates. Working frantically in the sub-zero temperatures, they managed to cut holes in the hull and pull 82 men out of the dark, freezing tomb. For the remaining hundreds, the tapping slowly grew weaker over the next few days, until there was only silence. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the massive, capsized hull of the Tirpitz remained in Hokoiboten. She was a grotesque, towering monument to the destruction of the Third Reich. To the newly liberated people of Norway, she was not a historical artifact to be preserved, but a deeply painful scar of occupation and a massive, dangerous navigation hazard sitting right outside their major northern port. Furthermore, Norway's post-war economy was shattered, and the country desperately needed resources to rebuild its destroyed infrastructure. The Tirpitz was a literal mountain of high-quality German steel. In 1948, the Norwegian government sold the salvage rights to the wreck to a joint Norwegian and German salvage company, Hovding Skipsopphugging. For nearly a decade, from 1948 until 1957, salvage crews transformed the quiet fjord into a massive, noisy industrial demolition site. The engineering challenges of dismantling a 50,000-ton capsized battleship in the freezing Arctic waters were immense. Divers had to swim into the dark, silt-filled interior of the ship, navigating collapsed bulkheads and live ammunition. They used underwater cutting torches to slice the massive vessel into manageable 100-ton chunks, which were then lifted onto giant salvage barges by heavy cranes. The salvage of the Tirpitz was a highly lucrative business, but it was also a somber, grim task. As the workers cut deep into the interior of the ship, they repeatedly came across the skeletal remains of the German sailors who had been trapped in the dark over a decade earlier. These remains were carefully recovered and buried with military honors in German war cemeteries in Norway. Piece by piece, the Queen of the North was systematically dismembered. Her massive steam turbines were pulled out, her armor plates were sliced away, and her structural ribs were melted down. The metal from the Tirpitz played a direct, unseen role in the post-war reconstruction of Norway. The heavy steel plates from her armored deck were repurposed by the Norwegian Public Roads Administration to cover excavation trenches and build temporary road systems in the capital city of Oslo. Even today, workers digging beneath the streets of Oslo occasionally uncover thick, high-tensile steel plates bearing the original inspector stamps of the Kriegsmarine. But there was another, far more scientific and highly valuable reason why the steel of the Tirpitz was so eagerly sought after by salvagers. It is a reason that connects this forgotten relic of World War II to the dawn of the atomic age and the exploration of outer space. On July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico, the United States detonated the world's first nuclear weapon. Weeks later, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the years that followed, the United States, the Soviet Union, and other global powers conducted hundreds of atmospheric nuclear tests, releasing massive amounts of radioactive isotopes, such as cobalt-60, into the Earth's atmosphere. Every single ton of steel manufactured anywhere in the world after 1945 was made using atmospheric air in the production process, primarily through the Bessemer or basic oxygen steelmaking methods. Because the atmosphere was now contaminated with trace amounts of background radiation, all modern steel produced after 1945 carries a minute, but measurable, radioactive signature. For ordinary construction, this background radiation is entirely harmless. But for highly sensitive scientific instruments, such as Geiger counters, medical radiation detectors, deep space sensors, and particle physics experiments, even the tiniest trace of radioactivity in the surrounding steel can completely ruin the delicate measurements. To build these ultra-sensitive devices, scientists required what is known as low background steel. The only way to obtain this steel was to salvage metal that had been manufactured and submerged underwater before the Trinity test of 1945. The water acted as a natural shield, protecting the submerged steel from atmospheric fallout. Suddenly, the massive, pristine hull of the Tirpitz, resting in the shallow Norwegian fjord, became a scientific goldmine. Her high-quality, pre-war Krupp steel, manufactured in the late 1930s, was entirely free of modern radioactive contamination. Tons of her steel plates were salvaged, carefully melted down without exposure to atmospheric contaminants, and converted into shielding for advanced medical equipment, scientific research facilities, and early space satellites. A ship built to bring destruction to the world was ultimately used to heal patients and help humanity touch the stars. By 1957, the salvage operation was officially complete. The visible remains of the Tirpitz had disappeared from the surface of the fjord. To the casual observer looking out across the calm, blue waters of Håkøybotn today, there is absolutely no sign that a world-changing historical drama ever took place here. But she is not entirely gone. If you put on a thick neoprene dry suit and plunge into the freezing dark waters of the fjord, descending past the swaying kelp forests to the silty bottom, you will eventually find her ghost. Deeply embedded in the thick mud of the seabed lie the massive, heavy remnants that the post-war salvagers simply could not remove. You will find colossal, jagged sections of her double-bottom hull, half buried in the sediment. You will see massive, rusted frames of her internal machinery, tangled webs of electrical wiring, and the heavy, circular bases of her secondary gun turrets. Nearby, the massive, hollow craters left by the near misses of the 12,000-pound tallboy bombs are still clearly visible as deep, muddy depressions on the seafloor, silent scars of a catastrophic morning in 1944. The remains of the Tirpitz have also left a strange, lasting imprint on the surrounding land. On the island of Hokoya, right next to the beach where she capsized, the land is still scarred by massive, water-filled craters where the tallboy bombs missed the ship and exploded on the shore. The local Norwegian communities have preserved these craters as natural monuments, and a modest gray granite memorial stone stands on the shoreline, overlooking the empty spot in the water where so many young men drew their final freezing breaths. Perhaps the most poignant and bizarre physical legacy of the Tirpitz is found in the local environment itself. To build the massive wooden decks of their battleships, the German Kriegsmarine imported vast quantities of high-grade teak wood from Southeast Asia. When the Tirpitz was blown apart and salvaged, large quantities of this extremely durable, water-resistant teak floated ashore or were gathered by local Norwegian farmers. For decades after the war, local residents used these thick, beautifully crafted planks of battleship teak to build garden fences, barn doors, and even the floors of their homes. If you walk through the quiet neighborhoods near the fjord today, you might still see a weathered, gray wooden fence that once felt the heavy boots of German sailors pacing the decks of Europe's largest battleship. The stark contrast between the Bismarck and the Tirpitz is one of the most fascinating paradoxes of naval history. The Bismarck, which sailed on only one active combat mission, sank a beloved British icon and was destroyed after a dramatic high-seas chase, has been immortalized as a pristine, untouchable deep-sea cathedral. She rests 3 miles down in the eternal, silent darkness of the abyssal plain, completely protected from the hands of salvagers and souvenir hunters, a perfect time capsule of her final, violent moments. Her sister, the Tirpitz, which spent her entire life hiding in the shadows of the Norwegian fjords, tying down fleets, and dictating global strategy through the sheer terror of her potential, was denied that quiet, dignified underwater grave. She was dismantled, sliced apart, melted down, and distributed across the world, her steel integrated into the very roads of the nation she once occupied, and the scientific instruments that explore our universe. This raises a profound and lingering question about how we, as a modern society, choose to remember and preserve the physical remnants of our darkest historical chapters. Is a shipwreck like the Bismarck truly preserved because it sits beyond our reach in the deep ocean? Or is a ship like the Tirpitz more deeply woven into the fabric of our world because its physical remains were recycled to rebuild a broken continent and push the boundaries of human knowledge? As we look out across the empty, peaceful waters of the Norwegian fjord today, we are left to wonder, what is the true legacy of these steel leviathans? Is it the tragedy of their violent ends, or the silent, invisible ways their remains continue to shape our lives today?